The White House operator's voice was shaking. "Mr. Davis, the President of the United States would like to speak with you." Miles Davis took a drag from his cigarette and said 5 words that would become legendary in Washington. "Tell him I'm not interested." What happened next didn't just shock the Reagan administration. It changed how America viewed artistic integrity forever. It was March 15, 1987, a Tuesday morning in New York City. Miles Davis was sitting in his brownstone on West 77th Street, wearing his usual uniform, black silk robe, dark sunglasses even though he was indoors, and an expression that suggested the world was one giant annoyance he was forced to tolerate. He was 60 years old, a living legend who'd revolutionized jazz 5 different times, and he had absolutely zero patience for anything he considered bullshit. The phone rang at exactly 10:30 a.m. Miles almost didn't answer it. He hated phones. But his girlfriend Jo Gelbard was in the shower, and the ringing was interrupting his morning ritual of coffee, cigarettes, and sketching in his art notebook. "Yeah," Miles answered, his voice that distinctive rasp that made every word sound like it was costing him something to say it. "Mr. Davis?" A woman's voice, professional, nervous. "This is the White House switchboard. Please hold for an important call." Miles should have hung up right then. He knew what important call meant in political circles, and he wanted no part of it. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven him to constantly reinvent his music, made him wait. A male voice came on the line, deep, confident, with that practiced warmth politicians use when they want something. "Miles, this is Ed Meese, counselor to the president. How are you this morning?" "Busy," Miles lied. He wasn't busy. He was avoiding being busy. But that was none of Ed Meese's business. "Well, I'll be brief then," Meese continued, his tone suggesting he was smiling. "President Reagan and the First Lady are hosting a state dinner next month, honoring the Prime Minister of Japan. We're looking to showcase the very best of American culture, and naturally, we thought of you. The president would be honored if you'd perform at the White House." Miles was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Meese asked, "Miles, are you still there?" "I'm thinking," Miles said. What Miles was actually thinking was this. Ronald Reagan had cut funding for the arts by 40%. He'd slashed the National Endowment for the Arts budget. He'd called jazz not real music in a view just 2 years earlier. And now he wanted Miles Davis, the king of that not real music, to come perform like a trained monkey for Japanese diplomats. "Mr. Davis," Meese continued, interpreting Miles's silence as consideration, "this would be a tremendous honor. The president specifically requested you. We're talking about a private performance in the East Room, attended by world leaders, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members. This is the kind of exposure that—" "Stop," Miles interrupted. "Let me ask you something. Does the president know who I am?" Meese laughed, that nervous political laugh. "Of course he does. You're Miles Davis. You're an American treasure. And does he know that I'm black?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Mr. Davis, I don't think—" "Because here's the thing," Miles continued, his voice getting colder. "Your boss spent the last 6 years pretending the AIDS crisis doesn't exist because it's mainly killing gay people and drug users. He opposed the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. He started his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, talking about states' rights, you know, where they murdered those 3 civil rights workers. And now he wants me to come play my horn so he can look cultured in front of the Japanese. Mr. Davis, the president has tremendous respect for—" Miles cut him off. "Tell him I'm not interested. 5 words. Simple, direct, devastating." "I'm sorry," Meese sounded like he'd been slapped. "You heard me. Tell Ronald Reagan I'm not interested in being his performing seal. Tell him if he wants to honor American culture, maybe he should stop cutting arts funding. Tell him if he wants to celebrate black excellence, Maybe he should acknowledge that black people are dying of AIDS and police brutality and poverty while he's serving caviar to diplomats. Mr. Davis, I really think you should reconsider. I've considered it. My answer is no. Actually, my answer is hell no. But I was trying to be polite. Miles hung up. Joe Gelbard came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, and found Miles staring at the phone with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The White House," Miles said, lighting another cigarette. "The White House? Like the actual White House?" "Yeah. Reagan wants me to play at some state dinner." Joe's eyes went wide. "That's incredible. What did you say?" Miles looked at her with those dark, intense eyes. "I told them I'm not interested." "You what?" "You heard me. I'm not interested in playing for Ronald Reagan. That man doesn't give a damn about jazz, about black people, about art. He just wants to look good for his Japanese friends." Joe sat down slowly on the couch. She'd been with Miles for 3 years, and she knew how he operated. Once he made up his mind about something, earthquakes couldn't change it. But this was the President of the United States. "Miles," she said carefully, "do you understand what you just did?" "Yeah," Miles replied. "I told the truth." What Miles didn't know was that his phone call was just the beginning. Ed Meese, shocked and slightly panicked, had immediately reported the conversation to Chief of Staff Donald Regan. Donald Regan, equally shocked, had taken the information to the president himself. Ronald Reagan's reaction, according to sources who were in the Oval Office that day, was a mixture of confusion and offense. "He said what?" Reagan had asked, as if he'd misheard. "He said he's not interested, sir," Donald Regan repeated. "And then he made some rather pointed comments about your policies." Reagan, who was used to deference from celebrities he'd spent decades in Hollywood, couldn't comprehend it. "Did we offer him money? These jazz musicians, they usually respond well to—" "Sir," Reagan interrupted carefully, "I don't think this is about money. I think this is political." What Reagan and his staff didn't understand was that Miles Davis had been political his entire life. Not political in the sense of joining parties or endorsing candidates, but political in the sense that his very existence as a black man who refused to compromise his vision was a political act. Miles had been beaten by police in 1959 outside Birdland, his own club, for the crime of being black and taking a cigarette break. He'd been refused service in restaurants, denied hotel rooms, subjected to the casual and systemic racism that defined mid-century America. And he'd responded not by being grateful for whatever scraps white America threw him, but by becoming even more uncompromising in his art and his life. So when Ronald Reagan, a man Miles saw as the embodiment of the white establishment that had spent decades trying to diminish him, asked him to perform, Miles's no wasn't just about one dinner. It was about every insult, every slight, every time someone had tried to make him smaller than he was. The news of Miles's rejection leaked within 48 hours. The Washington Post ran a story titled "Jazz Legend Refuses White House Invitation." The New York Times followed with an article exploring why Miles had said no. By the end of the week, every major newspaper in America was covering the story. The reaction split along predictable lines. Conservative commentators called Miles ungrateful, unpatriotic, and disrespectful. "Who does he think he is?" one Fox News pundit demanded. "The President of the United States personally invited him, and he can't be bothered to show up?" But in black communities, in jazz clubs, in artistic circles, Miles became an instant hero. Here was a man who'd been offered the highest honor American establishment could give an artist. And he'd said no because his principles mattered more than prestige. Dizzy Gillespie, the legendary jazz trumpeter and Miles's early mentor, was asked about the controversy during a concert in Chicago. "Miles did exactly what Miles always does," Dizzy said with a smile. "He told the truth. You might not like it, but you can't say the man isn't honest." Quincy Jones, who'd worked with both Miles and multiple presidents, took a more diplomatic approach. "I respect Miles's decision," he told reporters. Not everyone wants to perform for politicians, and that's their right. But it was writer and activist James Baldwin who perhaps best articulated what Miles's rejection meant. In an essay for The Nation, Baldwin wrote, "Miles Davis understands something that many Americans, particularly white Americans, refuse to acknowledge. That accepting an invitation to perform for power is not the same thing as being respected by power." Reagan didn't want to honor Miles Davis. He wanted to use Miles Davis, and Miles, being Miles, told him to go to hell. Meanwhile, back at the White House, the Reagan administration was in damage control mode. They couldn't understand why this had become such a big story. They'd invited plenty of artists to perform over the years, and everyone had been thrilled for the opportunity. Nancy Reagan, who considered herself a patron of the arts, was particularly upset. "What did we do wrong?" she asked her staff during a meeting. "We were trying to honor him." One of her junior advisors, a young black woman named Patricia Harris, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Reagan, if I may?" "Please," Nancy said. "Mr. Davis might feel that this administration hasn't done much to support the arts or the black community," Patricia said carefully. "The NEA budget cuts, the response to the AIDS crisis, some of the president's statements about civil rights." "But that has nothing to do with a state dinner," Nancy interrupted. "With respect, ma'am, for someone like Miles Davis, everything is connected. His art is inseparable from his identity as a black man in America. You can't ask him to set that aside for one evening." But later, according to her memoirs, she admitted that this conversation was the first time she'd really understood that for some people, politics wasn't just about parties and policies, it was personal. 2 weeks after the initial rejection, the White House tried again. This time they sent a formal written invitation, hand-delivered to Miles's brownstone. The letter, signed by President Reagan himself, emphasized the great honor and tremendous opportunity, and even mentioned a potential Presidential Medal of Arts down the line. Miles read the letter, laughed, and used it as a coaster for his coffee cup. But the story was far from over. What Miles did next transformed his rejection from a simple no into a powerful statement about art, politics, and principle. On April 12, 1987, exactly 1 week before the White House state dinner he'd refused to attend, Miles Davis organized his own event. He called it a Concert for Real America and held it in Harlem at the Apollo Theater. The concert was free, completely free. Miles covered all the costs himself, the venue rental, the sound equipment, the promotional materials, and he invited not diplomats or politicians or the elite, but the community, regular people, the people Reagan's policies had left behind. The line to get into the Apollo that night stretched for 6 blocks. Inside, the theater was packed with 1,500 people, teachers, nurses, construction workers, students, retirees, families. The demographic that rarely got to see Miles Davis perform because concert tickets were too expensive. Miles walked on stage at 8 p.m. sharp, wearing all white, a deliberate contrast to his usual black. He didn't say anything at first. He just started playing. Not his complex experimental fusion, but his classic material, So What, All Blues, Round Midnight. The songs that had defined jazz for a generation. Between songs, Miles did something he rarely did. He talked to the audience. "They wanted me to play for the president," he said, his raspy voice carrying through the microphone. "Some fancy dinner with diplomats and champagne. But I'm not interested in playing for people who cut arts programs while spending billions on weapons. I'm not interested in entertaining people who think AIDS is God's punishment. I'm not interested in being a token for an administration that treats black people like we're invisible." The crowd erupted in applause. "So instead, I'm here," Miles continued, "playing for you, because you're the real America. Not the politicians, not the millionaires. You, the people who love music not because it makes them look cultured, but because it feeds your soul." What happened at the Apollo that night became legendary. Miles played for 3 hours straight, longer than he performed in years. He brought out guest musicians, young jazz artists who were struggling to make it in Reagan's America, where arts funding was disappearing. He gave them the stage, let them solo, elevated them. And he announced something that shocked everyone. He was establishing a scholarship fund for young jazz musicians from low-income communities. The Real America Fund would provide full tuition, instruments, and living expenses for talented kids who couldn't afford formal music education. Reagan wants to cut arts funding, Miles said. Fine, I'll fund it myself. The next day, every major newspaper covered Miles's Apollo concert. The New York Times headline read, "Miles Davis responds to White House rejection with Harlem concert." But it was the Washington Post's headline that really captured the moment. Jazz legend shows Reagan what honoring America really means. Conservative media tried to spin the concert as a publicity stunt, but the narrative had shifted. Miles wasn't the ungrateful artist who'd rejected the president. He was the principled musician who'd chosen community over prestige. Donations to the Real America Fund poured in. Within a week, Miles had raised over $200,000. Within a month, $500,000. Musicians, actors, and artists who'd been afraid to speak out against Reagan suddenly found their voice. Harry Belafonte, the legendary singer and civil rights activist, announced he was matching Miles's scholarship fund dollar for dollar. Miles reminded us that we don't need the government's approval to do what's right, Belafonte said. Even some Republicans began to question the administration's arts policies. Senator John Warner of Virginia, a moderate Republican and arts supporter, gave a speech on the Senate floor defending Miles's right to reject the White House invitation and criticizing the NEA budget cuts. When we cut funding for the arts, we don't hurt the Miles Davises of the world, Warner said. They'll be fine. We hurt the young people who never become the next Miles Davis because they can't afford lessons or instruments or education. That's not conservative. That's just short-sighted. The Reagan White House, recognizing they'd badly mishandled the situation, tried to move on. But Nancy Reagan, to her credit, did something unexpected. She quietly reached out to Patricia Harris, the junior advisor who'd tried to explain Miles's perspective, and asked her to put together a report on how the administration could better support arts and culture in underserved communities. The report was never made public, but it led to small but significant changes. The NEA budget cuts were partially restored. New programs were created to bring arts education to inner-city schools. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was something. Miles Davis never commented publicly on these changes. He wasn't interested in claiming credit or declaring victory. He'd said what he needed to say, done what he needed to do, and moved on. But privately, to those close to him, Miles admitted he was satisfied. They got the message, he told Quincy Jones over drinks one evening. Maybe they didn't like it, but they got it. The story could have ended there, but there's one more chapter that makes this whole saga even more powerful. In 1991, Miles Davis died at the age of 65. His funeral was held at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Manhattan, and it was attended by thousands, musicians, activists, politicians from both parties, and regular people whose lives had been touched by his music. Among the attendees sitting quietly in the back row was Patricia Harris, the former Reagan advisor. After the funeral, she approached Joe Gelbard and introduced herself. "I wanted you to know," Patricia said, "that what Miles did in 1987 changed my life. I was young, working in an administration whose values I wasn't sure I agreed with. When Miles stood up to the president, it gave me the courage to use my voice too. I left the White House 6 months later and went to work for arts nonprofits. I've been doing that ever since." Joe took Patricia's hand. "Miles would have liked that," she said. "He always said the point wasn't to tear people down. It was to make them think." Today, the Real America Fund that Miles established is still operating. It's provided music education to over 10,000 young people. Several of those students have become professional musicians, teachers, and composers. They carry on Miles's legacy not just in the notes they play, but in the principle he embodied, that art should serve the people, not power. There's a recording of that 1987 Apollo concert in the Library of Congress now, preserved as part of American cultural history. And in the liner notes, there's a quote from Miles that perfectly captures why he said no to Reagan and yes to Harlem. They wanted me to play for the president, but I'd rather play for the people who made me president of jazz. That's where my loyalty is. That's where it's always been. The 5 words Miles Davis said to the White House operator, "Tell him I'm not interested," became more than just a rejection. They became a rallying cry for artists who understood that their work had value beyond what the powerful deemed acceptable. They became a reminder that saying no to the wrong opportunity is just as important as saying yes to the right one. Ronald Reagan served out his presidency and never invited Miles Davis to the White House again. But in a strange way, Miles's rejection accomplished what a performance never could. It started a national conversation about art, politics, and who gets to decide what has value. It reminded Americans that artists aren't decorations for power. They're voices of truth, especially when that truth is uncomfortable. The lesson of Miles Davis and Ronald Reagan isn't about politics. It's about integrity. It's about understanding that not every invitation is an honor. Some invitations are tests of whether you'll compromise your values for prestige. And when those invitations come, the most powerful thing you can say is what Miles said: "I'm not interested." Because sometimes the greatest performance an artist can give isn't on a stage at all. Sometimes it's the simple, revolutionary act of staying true to yourself when the whole world is pressuring you to bend. Miles Davis knew that. And on that March morning in 1987, when the White House operator asked him to hold for the president, Miles gave the performance of his life. It was only 5 words long, but it echoed through history. If this story of standing up for your principles, rejecting prestige for integrity, and choosing community over power moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to say no to the wrong opportunities. Have you ever rejected something that looked good on paper but felt wrong in your gut? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the legends who chose truth over convenience.